Our next session is our panel session. So, as some of you might know, yesterday, as part of the showcase, we held some outreach events with local schools, with City Academy, and we had some great interactions with them, and they've asked a couple of questions. In addition, this is our chance as a community, your chance to ask questions of the panel. We have a Slido for this. We're going to use Slido. So if any of you could, I'm standing right in front of it. You enter the code #JGI, you'll find the Slido, and we have James here who's going to be managing the questions. So please do put your questions in. There was a question already posed by somebody on the Slido, which we'll be taking as part of this session. And before we get going, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our Vice-Chancellor, Hugh Brady, who's just come to say a few words of introduction for the panel and welcome you here today. So over to you, Hugh.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, or good afternoon, everybody. I have the pleasure of being, I think, the only person in the room with a tie. So consider me a pre-COVID oddity. Fantastic to see so many people at this event. I think we had big ambitions, but to have almost 400 people signing up. This place is the only place I've been to in the last month or two, which looks busier than Bristol Airport. And as somebody did say, so much better organized. But please don't report that back. And if that's being taped, please scrub it. The Jean Golding Institute was a really important initiative for our university several years ago, but really recognized how data is at the heart of so many, in fact, arguably the vast majority of our research programs. And you've got a sense of that through the program over the day. We're only going to solve those problems facing humanity, be it transport, be it the environment, be it health, through clever, appropriate, well-judged use of data. So for us, this is a centerpiece for our university. It was fantastic to see it recognized, so much of the work recognized just very recently with the results of the Research Excellence Framework, the so-called REF, which is every 7 years a peer review of the quality of research in different disciplines across the UK. And the JGI and its outputs, just a shining example of what is great about our university and our city. And I mention both because, as you've got a sense from even the audience today, this is a true partnership with our city, a fantastic living laboratory. And within our university, it brings together not just our STEM, our science, our medical disciplines, but really importantly embraces the social sciences and the humanities, the behavioral sciences. And as I think we'll get a sense from this panel, you know, who owns our data? How do we steward our data? How do we look after it? Who should have access to it? Issues such as privacy, absolutely fundamentally important to our use and harnessing of data over the years ahead. So look, without that, I'm going to now hand over to our panelists, some of whom you've already met during the event. So Kate Robson-Brown, here beside me, Director of our Jean Golding, or JGI Institute, Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Biological Anthropology, and our institutional lead for the National Turing Institute. You've just heard from Hannah Fry, and the professor in the Mathematics of Cities at UCL, best-selling author, award-winning science presenter, and host of popular podcasts and television shows. Neil Lawrence joins us, DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge, co-host of Talking Machines podcast, and visiting professor at the University of Sheffield. I talked about partnerships. We have a really important and valued partnership with LV, and we're joined on the panel by David Silverstone, Director of Data Science for LV. And then finally, Awais Rashid. You're all aware of the importance of cyber security in our modern world, and Awais is Professor of Cybersecurity and Director of our Centre for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity at the University of Bristol. So I'll hand over to our chair for the session, Kate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hugh. Right, so we've got about 45 minutes to have a great discussion here. And so we're going to kick off with the questions. James is going to be our question master. Okay, so the first question is for Hannah. Thinking about how we can do good with data, what would you say are the positive impacts of data and AI today?
Hi. I think this should be a question for everyone, really. But I think for me, I am most excited by some of the work looking at science, really, actually. I think that there's, we have these incredible tools now, and I think that the way that they are changing the way that science is done and advancing that forwards, I think there's some really, really exciting stuff there. Just a kind of stupid example, if you think about taking salt out of water, right? It's like, sort of a not that interesting chemistry problem. You can do it, but it takes a lot of energy, it's quite expensive. But there are some people who are working on using AI to do that in a much more efficient way. And if you could crack that problem, right, this has not happened yet, but if you could crack that problem, then actually, if you think about the potential impact of that, it's gigantic, because there is no shortage of water on Earth, but there is a shortage of salt-free water. Actually, even the impact that it would have further downstream on things like climate change, being able to halt what do they call it? Desertification. I always say the wrong one. And I think that might be pudding. No, I've just described. But I think that it's for me, it's those problems. And Neil, perhaps you have stuff to say about this too, because I'm essentially talking about a lot of the work at DeepMind. But I think for me, the most exciting stuff, which have the biggest potential impact, are those so-called root node problems.
I think probably Hannah knows more about work at DeepMind than I do, because so I'm the DeepMind professor, but it's funded me. So I talk to them. I'm not too familiar with all the details, but I agree with what Hannah says. I think the thing that springs to mind for me that really excites me, I spend a lot of time worrying about the problems, but it's because I'm so excited about the potential and I don't want the problems to get in the way. So what really excites me is that this is all part of a new information infrastructure. And this information infrastructure offers, look outside, you can see historic infrastructure. I love these cranes. I'm guessing they're like 1930s. What we're in is historic infrastructure. If you're an emerging, developing economy today, a lot of what you will do now is use the information infrastructure. So countries like Kenya and Uganda actually have really good mobile phone communication networks. And I think the potential for me is reimagining all the things you see around us in Bristol and Sheffield, where I spent a lot of time, and imagining them, if you've got an information infrastructure as your starting point. So you don't build canals, you don't build roads, you don't build railways. How does your society look? And I just find that whole question very exciting, but I want those questions to be answered not by us as experts, but by empowering the people who live in those societies and in those places to take these technologies and use them for themselves to answer their own problems. And so that's a major frontier I'm interested in, which is how do we empower individuals to answer that question for themselves? Like, we shouldn't answer that question for them. We should give people the tools that allow them to safely deploy these technologies in their own contexts and allow them to come up with their own answers.
Thank you, Neil Awais. I wondered if you had any perspective on that too.
Okay. Well, I've got a microphone here. I think my perspective on this would be, so it was quite interesting. You mentioned the word information infrastructure, and one of the challenges always tends to be is working in cybersecurity. And as one of my colleagues in Switzerland once said, it's always a rainy day. So everything you hear on the news when there are big security breaches happen, we talk about, our data has been lost and our data, and all those are of course real, but that's also what we would refer to as what is called the FUD. It's always fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But if you look around, in the last 2 years, we've actually been using this information infrastructure. But we've not only just been using it because the technology is there or the infrastructure is there, it's because we have a certain degree of trust in that. And that comes from the fact that we know our communications are secure, or secure to a level that we can trust the system. You may all think that you earn money and you have actual money. No, you have data. It sits in a bank, okay? And you go and interact with that bank using cryptography every day. You go and pay for things, and your credit card systems work because there is security built in, there is authentication built in. So the point of the matter is that there are great opportunities with regards to data, and almost some of the things that are done with regards to security, they remain invisible. Unfortunately, when things go wrong, they become very, very visible, and I'm not downplaying that. But I think there is a lot of kind of positive things that happen around data and securing data and society to function, which we don't see. So to me, all of that goes hand in hand.
Great, thank you. Let's look at the next question. Okay, this is our question from City Academy students in Barton Hill. When we see data online and in the news, how can we be sure that the data is being communicated to us in an ethical and trustworthy way? Who would like to take that? David, you haven't said anything yet. Well, how about you? What do you think?
It's a really interesting question. I think there is no easy answer. A lot of it is events like this, actually, the public communication, the outreach work, and actually making people understand how is AI impacting their everyday lives? What are the sort of everyday journeys that you take as a customer of a company, or even moving around the city, that is being impacted by AI and machine learning? And then when it comes to reporting on figures in the media, obviously the media will put their own spin on it. If it's been reported by a person, they will have their own inherent bias in it as well. A lot of it is about understanding the example that Hannah gave before, actually what is accuracy? And is it always the right metric to be using? And actually to think about in a more meaningful way, what is the data being presented to you? What to actually represent? And is it relevant to the question being asked as well? Is the right question being asked, and is the data actually answering that question?
Yeah, Hannah, over to you.
I think to answer the question about whether it's being communicated to us in an ethical and trustworthy way, I think it isn't. and I think that actually there are many times where I've seen unethical and untrustworthy communications of data. And I think actually, I think that David's right about communicating that, the fact that you can't always trust the data that is seen is part of it. But I also think that it's about being skeptical about the things that you read and doing, sort of your own digging. I'm thinking here particularly about what happened with the COVID vaccine and how people really didn't want to, how an enormous number of people didn't want to be vaccinated. And actually a lot of data was used on that side of the argument as well. And actually often by quite mainstream commentators who had misunderstood something or who had a particular thing to push. So I think it's about being sort of talking about the fact that there are limits to this stuff. But I also think that it's about when you are doing good data, doing good data. What's the sentence of that? When you are doing good work in data, I think it's about being open and transparent and honest as much as you possibly can, because I think that the idea of trust, whereas it used to be, a big institution told you something was true and you believed it, I think that now the way that we get our information has changed so massively that trust has to be about a relationship. And I think that relationship has to be being truthful about what's bad as well as what's good. And I think only by being open and honest about the whole thing will you ever be able to be considered trustworthy by the public.
Awais, is there something kind of a particular kind of significance to the notion of trustworthiness in terms of cybersecurity?
Okay, I mean, this is a sort of a strange thing for me to say. I'm a computer scientist by background, and we often think that there are sort of good technical solutions to all these things. And there is a lot of really good work goes on, for example, in using AI and ML models to identify disinformation and those kind of things. But they're only a particular piece of the puzzle. I think the key sits in this point that Hannah is making, which is about transparency. If it is clear how the information is derived, and in computer science we have had open source software movements for a long time, because then there are many eyes on the thing, and people can actually look at it and see whether those things are derived and those conclusions are valid or not. I will also say though that I do not want to go when I'm reading some news to inspect all possible data. I can't. Okay, and I think then it becomes an interesting question as to what kind of markers we can provide in terms of the authenticity of information that comes, okay? But also, I think this is getting beyond my area of expertise, but how people actually interpret and make those decisions. And earlier there was a question about, is the person communicating the risk communicating in a particular way, or is the user interpreting in a particular way? So if I said to you, let me do this procedure on you, I'm a famous surgeon, and it has an 80% success rate, okay, you'd go, that sounds pretty good, okay? But if I said to you, 1 in 5 people die, okay, you will think very differently about it. And I think it's also how we present matters.
Thank you. Anyone else got, either of you? Neil, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think all that's very important. One thing I'm very interested in is, because things are changing quite quickly, I mean, I think sometimes we overstate how quickly things have changed. If you were alive in 1448, printing presses didn't exist. By 1520, Martin Luther is banging things up on wherever he banged his thing, sort of overthrowing the Pope, right? That's pretty major. That's 70 years. If you go back 70 years from today, you're actually at the development of the computer. So people have this sense that, oh, wow, aren't things changing quickly? Well, maybe, but maybe not. So you can look in history and see what's happened before when the information infrastructure has changed radically. And other examples would be the production of radio that sort of leads to the Second World War, both in terms of the way troops operate and propaganda is spread, old fake news. I think what's really interesting is how institutions become really, really important in dealing with that trust, because the point Awais was making, like, you don't want to go and check all these things for yourself. So what tends to happen, I think, is you get this emergence of institutions that people do trust, that you devolve some of your decision-making to. And one of my interests is, how do we get in a position where that happens much more quickly than it sort of happened in the past? Because even if it's moving things over decades, creating institutional trust is something that's quite slow. And as we know with banks, eroding institutional trust can happen extremely quickly. And it's sort of a little bit depressing that a natural place for this type of thing to have sat could have been the old banking system, the mutuals, all these sort of organizations, which were broadly, all our trust in those was kind of destroyed over the last 2 decades.
Thank you. I mean, one thing that interests me about this particular question, bearing in mind that this has come from a group of Year 10 students, is how they've got both ethics and trustworthiness within that sentence. I mean, they're not the same thing, are they? So what particularly maybe could we say about how we communicate the ethics of the data science that we do? I don't know if anyone wants to come in with that.
So I think one thing that's very dangerous around that is that the notion of a set of ethics that's universal seems to me in history to just lead to genocide every time, because it's like, this is the ethics I'm going to impose on society. And I think we've got a serious problem if we think that there's a universal ethics. What I think is that there's a diversity of, I mean, there's some things that we can think of as more important than others, but there's a diversity of opinions about how things should be done. And one of the very damaging things about the information infrastructure, the scale that things are happening, and the scale of platforms, is that there is a set of imposed ethics associated with that, and it's a singular ethics. And like, even if, Facebook have the best ethicists in the world, having one set of ethics in a situation is quite problematic. And I really don't quite know how we deal with that. I see that as quite a big problem.
At the same time, though, I'm thinking about things like the Bellman report, where, because this isn't a new problem, and, after the aftermath of the Second World War and lots of sort of very dodgy and not okay experiments that were done by medics, thinking of one in America, Tuskegee, there was a sort of international panel that came up with a set of ethics that were broadly considered universal. So I agree with you about sort of the minutiae, that you can't get to that level, but I do think that you can have some sort of fundamental boundaries.
Well, I love what you said earlier, Hannah, about how a company should address this, because while that's true, pulling that diversity of voices together beforehand to imagine the way in which things, because I think that's sort of true, but also the way in which ethical infringements impact different people in society, whether it's sort of indigenous groups or minority groups. And I think there's something also which I don't understand at all, so I shouldn't even talk about it really, but there's a difference between the West and our view of the individual as dominant, and the East, I think, quite often in the view of society as dominant. And it seems to me that neither of those things obviously outweighs the other. Individual and society are important, and balancing between them seems tricky.
That's really interesting, and I think we'll probably come up with some more questions that touch on some of that as well. So let's go to the next one. How can we calm people's worries about deep fakes, generative additive networks? They can be immensely powerful to generate training data, especially in medicine. Deep fakes. Who wants to take that one? Go on then.
I'm talking too much. I'm sorry. Okay, so I think the big thing about a new form of information that can be faked is that everybody gets very upset about it very quickly, and then I think it's sort of the same pattern. So I'm thinking about the photographs that were doctored to include fairies in the garden in like 1905 or something, or like Photoshop or fake audio. I think that this stuff, it has happened before. We have been there before, and I think that the ultimate answer about deep fakes is that even when they get to the point where they're so sophisticated that they're indistinguishable from reality, the key point is that you still can tell the source of where something comes from and the context that something arrives in. For example, if you see a video of, I don't know, Barack Obama twirling in a tutu, right, and it's posted on a YouTube channel, well, what else did that YouTube channel post, right? What other things, the people that are commenting and sharing that, what kind of things are they doing? And I think that actually there is a way to have a sense of the credibility of something beyond looking at the thing itself. So maybe I should be a bit more, but I'm actually not that worried about deepfakes.
Yeah, Awais, go ahead.
I think the interesting thing about things like deepfakes is that with any technology, there is always the kind of dual use issue. So we are in Bristol. There is a big creative sector here, and there are great possibilities about using that kind of computer-generated imagery to do kind of interesting work around making movies or other kind of things, which are fantastic. So I think not everything always tends to be a negative. However, going back to that, I think there are other things also that we can do beyond also looking at what other kinds of things surround that information that is coming, by really looking towards, can we build authentication markers into that? As a security researcher, I would go towards that. But you can embed those kind of things. We have built these kind of things. You call NFTs a fad or whatever, but those kind of authenticity and provenance sets, right? And that has sat in other contexts. People are able to prove kind of provenance of kind of historical artwork and all sorts of things. But we now have digital equivalents of that. And we can build those kind of things in, so that when we know that if Barack Obama is dancing in a tutu, it is actually Barack Obama. So we can tell that for sure.
What he gets up to on a Wednesday afternoon is his own business.
I know.
What about the bit of the question that's talking about, I suppose, the generation of synthetic data to create training data for in medicine?
So it's one of these things I think does have a lot of possibilities, but this is a really tricky subject. And I think the key issue here is that you want to get, in order to get good models, you want as many people to see the data as possible. But when it comes to medical data, you want as few people to see the data as possible. And you can contrast that to things like computational biology data, where it's often organisms that we worry less about the privacy of, and you see enormous progress. And a lot of people have talked about this, and I do think it's interesting as a sort of direction to go. But it feels somewhat unproven, and it's one of those things where, sure, that seems like a good idea, but I worry about the extent to which it's seen as a solution. And it's being seen as a solution when we're still in a position where we're only getting trusted research environments together. I think the Goldacre report talks a lot about that. It would be, I think that there's so many sociological and technical, there's security problems, but there's also getting an established body of data scientists who you trust to look at this data and not do silly things. And these are sort of hard sociological problems. And this sounds like a cool techno solution. And it's true that cool techno solutions sometimes can help, but my general experience with them is they often don't help. And you really have to just do the hard work of getting groups together to do this in a sort of trustworthy way. But it would be great if it does work.
Can I ask David, has your industry, the insurance industry, used synthetic data as part of your kind of modelling process, for example, for pricing or risk or anything like that?
Yeah, it's increasingly being looked into, particularly in areas where you have less history yourself. You can use synthetic data to try and balance it out. But I think, as Neil said, there are some real concerns about there's no real agreed framework for the accuracy of synthetic data. And actually, you need to justify it's a heavily regulated environment that any models that you build on a potential synthetic data source would still lead to fair customer outcomes and could still be explained in the same way. Actually, one of the potential uses of synthetic data is it enables data that would be considered individually sensitive data potentially. If it's generated synthetically, it allows it to be shared with academic partners in order to form more detailed research on new techniques. But then actually, when those techniques were then implemented in a way that directly impacts customers, you'd probably go back to the actual data itself in that case.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Hannah, jump in.
I wonder actually, how do you think that compares to something like the new forms of encryption, like homomorphic encryption?
Okay, so I mean, synthetic data is one possibility to preserve privacy. There are of course other mechanisms out there. You can do things like secure multi-party computation, where different parties only know partial information about the data. So let's say we all go out to dinner and we decide that we pay proportionally to what we earn, but we don't want to disclose our salary. Then and we know that, for example, I would pick on I'd always cheat and lie. So, but the point is that you still are able to do that and pay your fair share without revealing what you earn. And then there are other things like, fully homomorphic encryption, but they're also quite some distance away, because without getting to the key sizes are so large that we don't have kind of manageable ways of doing that. So I would sort of, agree with Neil that I think synthetic data is one element in that kind of, toolbox of things that we can use in this regard. But it's not the only element. I would also suspect that for some applications, I know it's been used in, for example, kind of banking kind of applications quite actively, where perhaps it works better than, for instance, than medical science, where you probably need kind of more actual data.
Just to build on that a bit, I'm very interested in synthetic data when it's created from, say, a simulation that an expert's created that captures some aspect of the system. So less like I've trained the synthetic data on very large amounts of things, more like, oh, this physicist has this model of the way they think things work, or we've got a climate simulation. And that's a way of generating, and different climate simulations have strengths and weaknesses. So I think that's a really, really interesting area, and I like it so much because it brings you very close to scientists and domain experts. One of the great things about working in data, and we saw this beautifully in Hannah's talk, you just get to play in all sorts of fun domains. I mean, it's sort of like, my mum totally can't understand, how are you talking to a Formula One team and then talking to UK cancer research? This doesn't make sense. And of course, the answer is data. But if you want to get closer to scientists who often have less data, then you get into simulations that are scientific, mechanistic simulations. And I think that's a really exciting area that I think will be bigger than, maybe not in medicine, but bigger than just GANs. But maybe I'm wrong.
I totally agree about the multidisciplinarity that you get working in this kind of field, and I'm sure that's a sentiment that's shared throughout the room as well. You have a toolkit, and that toolkit allows you to explore exciting questions in all kinds of domains, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I recommend it as a career to all kinds of people as well. Okay, James, let's have the next question. What does the future of data science and AI look like? What could it mean for everyday people? I hear a lot about deep learning models like GPT-3 from massive tech companies. Are these giant models useful in practice, or is this more an exercise in research and pushing the boundaries in engineering? So this is about practical applications. Who wants to go first? David, you look like you're jumping in. Great.
Yeah, I think businesses make hundreds of decisions every day that impact customers throughout the entire product lifecycle, what they want, what then happens, the sort of journeys that they go down. And currently, for the majority of those decisions, there is no level of automation or AI in place. They're still made by people. And actually, where AI can be incredibly effective is in improving those decisions, making them more accurately, more efficiently, speeding up the process, leading to better outcomes for customers. But often going to the latest deep learning model like GPT-3, it would be over the top. You don't need that level of sophistication. And actually, a lot of the benefit can be derived from a simpler model that then has its own benefits. So like Torty was talking about before, the simpler models, they are more interpretable, they're more explainable. You can communicate to people why a decision has been made in the way that it has done which is harder to do with the deep learning model. That's not to say it's impossible to do, but it's a different consideration. And actually, a lot of the benefit you can take can be done by starting off simply and then iteratively improving.
Yeah, Hannah.
I agree with all of that. I think that things like GPT-3 do have like a real commercial value. If you think about when you, actually the examples that you were given earlier, I'm talking about when you're interacting with a machine and you're saying, okay, what is German for 86 or whatever your example was, and it misunderstands you, actually those things are improved by large language models. I think though, for me, the GPT-3 as an example, the big thing that I think about it isn't so much about like the sort of commercial viability or like how impressive it is. I think that I'm much, much more concerned about these large language models than I am about deep fakes. Allow me to tell you why. Okay, so my husband, right, he doesn't care about privacy in terms of like what he does on the internet. He's like, just clicks yes to cookies every single time, like whatever, uses all the bad browsers, whatever. And he's like, well, I'm just not that interesting, right? No one cares who, whatever. Except that, of course, for the last decade, there had been, and probably longer, there have been, it's been profitable to harvest information about you as an individual. So information about how gullible you are, he's quite gullible, information about all kinds of things, right? There are like, there will be files somewhere in a data center somewhere with your name on it or an ID number, that identifies you, that talk about whether you've used drugs, whether you've had an abortion, whether your true sexuality matches up with your declared sexuality, the things you worry about in the middle of the night, right? All of that stuff is recorded. Now, here's the thing. Once we get to the stage, and I think GPT-3 isn't quite there yet, but once we get to the stage where you can create a sophisticated simulation of a human interaction, then you can, at the moment, misinformation, the way misinformation is spread is like someone does a blog post that's nonsense and it's spread by Twitter bots. But the thing is that now imagine that like my husband, you can automatically work out what swimming club he goes to, and you can create a character in the Facebook group that talks to him and then shares something in common with him. But not just one character, you can create a whole cast of characters around him that don't really exist, each of them with different personalities, all automatically generated based on his individual data. But that wouldn't just happen to him, imagine it happened to everybody who he knows in real life too. And if you do that, actually it becomes very possible to steer public discourse in a particular direction and to be extremely divisive. There's a white paper from I've blanked on the name, but the US security something, where they talked about this as a genuine threat, a very modern form of warfare. And I think for me, the things about these kind of models, although I sort of think it's a bit, it's possible and therefore it will happen. I don't think you can stop it happening. But I do think that actually the big thing for me isn't so much about how useful they are in practice, it's about how dangerous they potentially are.
Yep, Awais, you were the first to jump in there.
Yeah, so you actually stole my line. Because it's usually my job as a security and privacy person, bring that thing down and go, let's just, not do this.
We can share it. You can bring them down more. Yeah. There's further to go.
There is an interesting kind of little game out there where you have to kind of thread what do you use in terms of social media. And I encourage you to go and spot my thread, which says, I don't use it. And then what are the concerns you have? And I think I was the first one that someone pointed out that said surveillance and all those kind of things. And I think that's our problem. So data is a wonderful thing. But I think we also seem to not always consider what happens with that data. And there is two sides to this. As to what we are giving up, so we often think there is a free lunch. There isn't a free lunch. Maybe today there is, but not any other time. But also as organizations or systems, we have gotten used to collecting everything. And I have these conversations with organizations where they go, we are going to have this data, what can we mine out of it? And my question to them tends to be, what do you need from it? And then you should decide what you need to collect, right? So your example of cookies is very interesting. If you look at some of the kind of research out there, when you go and click on those cookies, behind the scenes in real time, there is an auction, there is a bidding going on, where all sorts of information about you is being integrated. So while you may be anonymous, you're kind of not really, and to serve ads to you. And people, these systems automatically bid to serve ads to you. And you can play this game. You can actually allow some cookies and see how quickly someone then wants to sell you a product on your next website. And it's ridiculously quick. It's not something that there is scientific evidence around this. And I think that's really the fundamental question, that data is a wonderful thing. These models are, great at doing some things. But just doing because we can is not something we should be doing. We should be thinking about what data is needed, what do we give up, and as a security and privacy researcher, I would also argue that privacy is equally fundamentally important. But at the moment, the balance is always the other way, where we think we have to give up potentially a lot to get something in return, and we are not sure what we are getting. So,
Neil, I can see you itching to jump in there.
I just wanted to sort of, I think, build on what's been said and try and categorize some of what David said versus what Hannah mentioned. That I sometimes try and think of these things as the way in which the world could go. I like to split it into Brownfield innovation and Greenfield innovation. And I sort of think of Brownfield innovation like we're in a warehouse that has been repurposed. So you're taking some existing structure and you're trying to improve it. So a lot of what David said is related to that. I spent time working in the Amazon supply chain. So like supply chain can benefit from that type of decision making. And there's sort of efficiencies to be gained. And that's very exciting. But with GPT-3, and Hannah's sort of talked about some of the things you could imagine. One of the things I think, so I love this thing called the Solow paradox. People know about that. So it's Robert Solow, who was an economist speaking in the 1980s, saying, we see computers everywhere apart from in the productivity statistics. And what he's really referring to is the fact that everyone loves to talk about computers, but they're not actually having a financial benefit on how effective companies are being. And so I have a further observation on this, is we don't actually talk about computers anymore. And the reason we don't talk about computers anymore is because they're utterly integrated in the way that we're doing things. I also have an observation that I was 11 in 1983 when I got a BBC B computer, which my dad bought because it was going to help with our education, and we spent all our time playing games on it. And actually what has happened, which is the Greenfield innovation, is the games industry is massive. And we should all be very thankful for that, because I think the reason the internet didn't collapse was because of the bandwidth we all had at our homes from children playing Xboxes, and which turned out, when I checked my stats, my video conferencing was way less than the Xbox traffic that was going between them and other people. So that type of greenfield innovation is super difficult to predict. I mean, maybe in retrospect we could predict it, but when you've got things like large language models, no one asked for those. No one said, oh my goodness, we need one of these things, and this is why we're building for that. It's just people said, oh, I wonder how far you can take this. And it's taken it way beyond what anyone expected, like just through data and large models, how realistic you can get these things going. But we don't really have a use for it yet. I mean, we maybe do. But what's going to happen is there's going to be this generation of people that come along, and these things already exist. And they're going to be far better at coming up with cool uses for this sort of thing than we are. Hopefully not the ones Hannah mentioned, maybe like future Banksy type peoples, that sort of thing. And I think that that's really hard to do. So when I'm trying to get back to the question, sorry, I'm going on too long, what could it mean for everyday people? I think it's so hard to say for that greenfield innovation. I kind of hope that the effect that Hannah's talking about means people stop interacting online because it could be a bot and start interacting in person. But when they're doing those interactions in person, those interactions are enhanced, that would be my hope, by these really cool, interesting tools.
Well, I think that's a brilliant moment to say, I'm afraid time has flown, our time is up, and we've got 20 minutes for interacting in person. Okay, so now it's time for our lunch break. Put your hands together to say thank you to our panel.